Hi, this is the AI Storyteller. I'm Mark. The book we are interpreting for you in this issue is the classic British literary masterpiece, Gulliver's Travels. If the name Gulliver still seems somewhat unfamiliar to you, then as soon as you hear about the land of the giants and the Lilliputians, most readers will reflexively think of a certain version of a comic book or an animated series. However, today, we are here to set the record straight about this literary classic. In fact, Gulliver's Travels is not a children's book but rather a scathing work of satire. Its author, Jonathan Swift, was one of the most renowned satirists of the 18th century in Britain. The initial edition of this novel was published in October 1726, just 1 month before Swift's 50th birthday. It is important to briefly outline Swift's life because we can see the origins of Gulliver's Travels in his experiences. As an Englishman born in Ireland, Swift's life was entangled in the political and religious struggles between Britain and Ireland for most of his life, experiencing the oppressive colonial rule of Britain over Ireland. He witnessed the genesis of the two-party system in Britain after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which established a constitutional monarchy in Britain and consolidated the previously diverse parliamentary factions into two main parties, the Whigs, who supported the overthrow of the king, and the Tories, who supported the retention of the king. Swift initially aligned himself with the Whigs but later switched to the Tories due to differences in political views. In 1704, he published two of his seminal works, A Tale of a Tub and The Battle of the Books, simultaneously in London, catapulting himself into the position of the most influential political writer of the time. He also co-founded the satirical literary society known as the Scribblers' Club, where he and his friends gathered to lampoon the politics and literature of their era. At the height of his career, Swift even served as a public relations officer for the government, and became the editor of the Tory newspaper The Examiner. Unfortunately, his career took a downward turn, and with the decline of the Tory party, Swift's political career effectively ended. Later, he resided in Dublin and wrote numerous works supporting Ireland's resistance to British colonial rule. Among these, the most famous is A Modest Proposal, a scathing piece of irony that suggests selling poor Irish children to rich Englishmen as a source of food. It criticized the dire social conditions in Ireland at the time and the oppression and exploitation of Ireland by Britain. Now let's return to Gulliver's Travels. Swift's writing is meticulously structured and profoundly insightful. Gulliver's Travels is divided into 4 main parts, each depicting Gulliver's experiences in the land of Lilliput, the land of Brobdingnag, the flying island of Laputa, and the land of the Houyhnhnms. We will delve into each of these parts in due course. The most widely circulated versions of this book have undergone some degree of abridgment. In Britain, a certain Dr. Thomas Bowdler, famous for publishing the Family Shakespeare or the Bowdlerized Shakespeare, did not spare Gulliver's Travels. He removed what he considered crude language and content, especially portions unsuitable for general readers, particularly women and children. In comparison, the abridged versions had an advantage in terms of acceptability and printing costs. Consequently, the majority of British households at the time had this milder version. In many film adaptations of the novel, Gulliver only visits the lands of Lilliput and Brobdingnag, and the conflicts between nations were rewritten as classic fairy tale plotlines, focusing on star-crossed lovers who ultimately find happiness with the help of benevolent outsiders. So, what exactly did Swift's novel contain that was so scandalous, causing publishers from the Victorian era to the present day to steer clear of it? Since censors deemed the book somewhat inappropriate for children, how did it evolve into a classic of children's literature? To answer these two questions, we need to go back to the novel itself. The novel begins with 2 letters. The first is written by the protagonist, Gulliver, to his cousin Simpson. He complains that it was at his cousin's urging that he published his travelogue, which resulted in extensive alterations to his manuscript and led to a barrage of accusations and criticisms upon publication. His original intention was to use his own travel experiences to educate the public, but instead of achieving his goal, many readers wrote to him, claiming that the entire affair was a fabrication and that the 4 countries mentioned in the text didn't even exist. It's worth noting that this letter was added in the 1735 reissue. In 1726, the publisher removed sensitive scenes from the original text to evade censorship. The complete version of Gulliver's Travels that we read today didn't appear until 1899, as part of the collected works of Swift. The second letter is written in the voice of Gulliver's purported cousin and publisher, Simpson, to the readers, adding an air of authenticity to this deceptive narrative game. This Simpson claims to have truly known Mr. Gulliver, even going so far as to visit his family's grave and inquire among the neighbors, confirming that he never told a falsehood. Thus, readers can safely believe the author's description of his own circumstances. Here is a point to note. In the early stages of the development of the novel as a literary form, the boundary between fiction and nonfiction was still relatively blurred. Novels often provided a seemingly real foundation for their plots and characters at the beginning. The most common method was to claim, "A friend of a friend or a friend's friend gave me a manuscript, and I have decided to share it with the public after some handling." Gulliver's Travels falls into this category as well. So, there is no need to delve into whether Swift actually had a relative who was a publisher, and one should not assume that the protagonist Gulliver is Swift himself. In fact, the name Gulliver is derived from the English word gullibility, which means easily deceived. This is the author's way of hinting that, like other novels, you don't need to concern yourself with whether it is true or false. From the 2 pages where the protagonist Gulliver describes his background, we can see that he is a rather practical person. His father was a small estate owner with 5 sons, and Gulliver was the third. Inheritance was out of the question, so after completing his secondary education, he first went to London and then studied medicine in Holland, while also gaining knowledge related to navigation. After graduating, he went on several sea voyages, earned some money, and settled in London. In order to improve his living conditions, Gulliver married a well-off woman with a substantial dowry of £400. However, this wasn't enough for him to live a worry-free life. He subsequently worked as a doctor for several years, went to sea again a few times, and moved homes multiple times, all in the pursuit of making a living. Readers who have experienced Robinson Crusoe will easily find echoes of Robinson's story in these 2 pages. Although Swift consistently denied that Gulliver was inspired by Robinson, his choice of this theme was undoubtedly influenced by the prevailing travelogue trend in British literature in the 18th century. Against the backdrop of the age of exploration, a plethora of guidebooks, travel diaries, collections of letters, and various travel novels emerged. In these works, travelers visited foreign lands, faced different challenges, adapted to changing environments with their knowledge, and gained a better understanding of their own country through their observations of the outside world. Of course, such writing was not without exaggeration and fabrication. All of these elements provided the perfect canvas for Swift's satirical pen. In the first part of the adventure, the ship Gulliver was on encountered a storm, and he ended up stranded on a deserted island. When he woke up, he found himself tied down by a group of tiny people, only 15 centimeters tall. After a standoff, Gulliver chose to observe the situation. He realized that these little people were quite reasonable. They provided him with food and drink and offered him temporary shelter in the largest building in their country. While his freedom of movement was restricted by the king, overall, they treated him with friendliness. After spending some time there, he gradually learned about the internal affairs of this diminutive nation. These people placed a high value on moral conduct over abilities and strongly opposed deceit and ingratitude. However, they paid little attention to raising their offspring, sending children to full-time care before they were even 2 years old. The political situation in this country was equally absurd. In the king's court, candidates for vacant positions had to perform a high-wire act in the sky, and the one who performed the most impressive feats on the tightrope would secure the position. Similar to England, this country had 2 opposing political parties. The Low Heels party used to dominate, but the current king favored the High Heels party. As the name suggests, you could easily tell which party someone belonged to by the height of their shoe heels. Even more ridiculous was the fact that the war between this country and its neighboring nation was triggered by a dispute over which end of a boiled egg to crack first. The 2 countries debated fiercely and even resorted to physical fights over whether to crack the big end or the small end first. This absurd war had been ongoing for 3 years, and in the end, the land of the little people achieved a one-sided victory thanks to Gulliver's decisive physical advantage. Surprisingly, Gulliver received no commendation and was ostracized for opposing the king's foreign policy. Not long after that, another incident jeopardized Gulliver's standing in the land of the little people. One night, the royal palace accidentally caught fire, and with no time to fetch water, Gulliver had to urinate on the flames. While he saved most of the building, this act earned him the Queen's displeasure. Combined with false rumors spread by some ministers who opposed him, the king decided to blind him and leave him to starve to death. Fortunately, a friend tipped him off, and Gulliver escaped to a neighboring country, eventually finding his way back to England. After being home for less than 2 months, Gulliver, whose nature and destiny always led him to an unsettled way of life, embarked on another sea voyage. This time, he encountered a storm and ended up in a country that was the polar opposite of the land of the little people, a nation inhabited by gigantic beings. Gulliver, facing these giants, felt as the citizens of the land of the little people felt when they saw him. Even infants and pets posed a huge threat to him, and his treatment in this country was only marginally better than that of a pet. He was initially picked up by a peasant family from a field, put on display at a market for people to marvel at, and worked to exhaustion every day. Eventually, the peasants realized that Gulliver was on the verge of death and, in an attempt to make some money, sold him to the Queen of the Giants. Within the palace, Gulliver faced a series of dangers, but the threats came not from normal-looking humans but from dogs, small birds, frogs, monkeys, and the Queen's dwarf attendants. In addition to the inconvenience caused by the size difference, what deeply unsettled him were the women of this country. At first, while staying with the peasants, Gulliver was repulsed by the wet nurse's enormous breasts, as she breastfed an infant. After entering the palace, Gulliver was often confined to the maids' quarters, where he had a close-up view of the giant women's skin conditions and physiological needs, all of which made him extremely uncomfortable. After some time, Gulliver got along well with the king, and he shared stories about the politics and history of England and Europe out of curiosity. Surprisingly, the king's response was, "Your race is the most odious little vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth." Gulliver, who loved his homeland and truth, could not agree with such slander. He attempted to change the king's impression through lies but discovered that this country had no understanding of politics whatsoever. From top to bottom, they only valued morality and practicality, and they naturally could not grasp the concept of political intrigue. Finally, during an outing with the king and queen, Gulliver's tiny dwelling was thrown into the sea by a seabird, and he was rescued by a passing ship, which took him back to England. At this point, we can easily understand why children would naturally feel a connection to these two stories. In addition to the adventurous and curious nature of these tales, the differences in body size align perfectly with the different psychological states children experience when interacting with toys and adults. Of course, what fascinated the common people of 18th century England even more were Swift's sharp wit and satirical depictions that hit close to home. The high heels and low heels parties were undoubtedly a mockery of the Whigs and Tories. The heated debates over whether to crack the big end or the small end of an egg represented the historical religious disputes between Catholics and Protestants regarding the rituals. And the war with the neighboring country reflected England's long-standing struggle with France for maritime dominance. Swift also included his political rivals and other contemporary events in the narrative, inviting interested readers to explore further. However, that's not all. In the chapter set in the land of the giants, Swift used the voice of the king to sharply criticize the English as a group, causing publishers to add a section praising Queen and to balance it out. Additionally, Swift's candid descriptions of female anatomy and desires were labeled as not suitable for children and misogynistic. All of these factors led to criticism and controversy surrounding Gulliver's travels from the very beginning, fueling the Gulliver fever that swept through London and all of England. Just 2 months after its publication, the book had already gone through 20,000 copies, surpassing the circulation of the newspaper The Observer sevenfold. Nearly 500,000 people in all of London had read the book at the time, a remarkable number considering the city's population was only around 700,000. It's easy to imagine that everyone wanted to uncover hidden meanings and engage in discussions, regardless of whether the author intended them. Many critics believe that the first two chapters were too blatantly allegorical to be considered satirical. Dr. Samuel Johnson, a literary giant who dominated the 18th century English literary scene, once dismissively said, "As soon as we can define big endians and little endians, the rest is pretty easy." However, beyond literary criticism, Swift himself was a target of many attacks. Besides his earlier political shift from the Whigs to the Tories, the vehement critiques he faced were also intertwined with the social environment of the time. In 1695, the British Parliament declared the end of a 30-year-old system of press censorship, leading to an explosive growth in the printing industry and the emergence of what philosopher Habermas called the public sphere. Citizens gathered voluntarily in places like coffee houses to discuss public affairs, ranging from art and literature to economics and politics, forming a kind of public opinion. It's not an exaggeration to say that 18th century British writers faced the most intense, timely, and multifaceted criticism in history, sometimes even descending into a dog-eat-dog situation. In the year of Gulliver's Travels publication, this situation reached its peak. Legend has it that after Swift's death, his ghost roamed the corridors of St. Patrick's Cathedral, where he had served as a bishop, complaining that there are enough pamphlets criticizing me to fill a library. However, despite the criticism of the allegorical nature of the land of the giants and the flying islands' satirical reflections of reality, they pale in comparison to the last two chapters. Throughout the 19th century, critics and biographers viewed the stories of the floating island and the Houyhnhnms as reflections of Swift's mental illness and believed he had a misanthropic tendency. To understand why this misconception arose, let's first examine what these last two chapters are about. Gulliver's third voyage, which occurred only about 10 days after the second, brought him into the midst of pirates, and he ended up on a deserted island. By chance, he landed on a flying island inhabited by a group of peculiar beings. Their heads were inclined to one side, and their eyes could not focus directly on each other. They walked and talked absent-mindedly, and each person had a servant who would strike their heads to help them concentrate. The inhabitants of this island were obsessed with impractical scientific research, such as predicting when comets would collide with the Earth, while remaining indifferent to practical aspects of life, even if their wives openly engaged in extramarital affairs. Gulliver provided a detailed description of the island's shape, size, method of flight, and range. The island's ability to fly was entirely dependent on a large lodestone located at its base. If there was any rebellion, the king would order the island to fly over the rebellious city, blocking out sunlight and rain, and hurling stones down from above. This tactic had worked effectively until 3 years ago when residents of a city, using the principle that magnets repel like poles and attract opposite poles, nullified the king's threat and forced him to agree to their terms. 2 months later, Gulliver grew tired of being stuck on this island all day and applied to visit other places. He arrived at the Scientific Academy under the king's jurisdiction and observed so-called scientists indulging in wild and bizarre ideas, like converting human excrement back into food or refining ice into gunpowder. There were also experiments involving building houses from the roof downwards and using pigs for plowing, all of which were bewildering. After leaving the floating island, Gulliver reached the island of the sorcerers, where he was granted a generous opportunity to satisfy his curiosity. There, he encountered many famous historical figures and came to realize that what he had read as history was mostly fictitious. He discovered that the world's progress had been driven by petty and accidental acts rather than the grand deeds attributed to so-called great men. As time passed, these immortals, who possessed eternal life, grew increasingly foolish. They could not overcome the weaknesses inherent in humanity, and became the most detestable beings in the nation. In the end, Gulliver found himself deeply disillusioned and ended his third adventure, returning once more to England. According to later evidence, it is suggested that Swift may have written the content of the third chapter last. Given the richness of its content, this claim holds some merit. While there are also allegorical references to reality, such as the palace on the flying island mirroring the political situation during the reign of George I and the conflict between the king and the town evidently pointing to Ireland's resistance to England, and the absurd Scientific Academy being a variant of the Royal Society of London overall. Swift's satirical targets shift from specific individuals and events in the first 2 chapters to more abstract concepts in these later chapters. In his time, the Enlightenment had already established the foundation of reason above all in Europe. Science and rationality were celebrated, with science often personified as a goddess. Swift, however, rejected this uncritical veneration of intellectual and philosophical thought. He even named the floating island Laputa, a Spanish word meaning whore or prostitute. As Gulliver's disillusionment with every aspect of human idealism deepened, his narrative perspective gradually detached from the story. He transformed from being a beholder in the first 2 chapters to an outsider or spectator. However, Swift wasn't about to spare his own protagonist. After his 4th voyage, Gulliver not only became thoroughly disheartened but also began to doubt the correctness of his own existence as a human being. In his final voyage, Gulliver, once again, failed to learn from his past mistakes and ended up as the ship's captain. As expected, he found himself stranded on a deserted island, inhabited by 2 distinct species, the highly rational and polite hounds, which were essentially intelligent horses capable of using tools with their forelimbs, and the savage and primitive yahoos, which were human-like beings like Gulliver himself. Initially, Gulliver struggled to accept this reality, constantly defending himself and his fellow humans. He even refused to remove his clothes in front of the hounds to differentiate himself from the naked yahoos. However, a disturbing incident in which he was attacked by a lustful female yahoo while bathing in a river forced him to confront the undeniable fact that he belonged to this repulsive species. As Gulliver delved deeper into the hounds' society and learned their language, his sentiments gradually shifted towards this entirely different species. According to his descriptions, everything here was orderly, governed by reason, and emphasized friendship, generosity, simplicity, and tranquility. There was no party strife, slander, or deceit present in human society. The only negative emotion was the revulsion directed towards the yahoos. In Gulliver's view, the hounds were perfect rationalists and worthy of human reverence and emulation. The land of the hounds seemed to be the ideal utopia. However, as Gulliver's narrative unfolds, we come to realize that the hounds lack any trace of humanity. They are not only dull but also devoid of emotions, essentially cold-blooded creatures. Yet, Gulliver remains utterly blind to this fact and eventually abandons his own thoughts, wholeheartedly embracing the hound's virtues and way of life. Despite his desire to live among the horses, far from human society, he is ultimately expelled due to the inherent nature of being a yahoo. At this point, Gulliver's voyages come to an end, and what we see is not a returning traveler but a disillusioned moralist. On the surface, each of these 4 chapters constitutes a complete story. However, collectively, we witness the gradual degradation of Gulliver's human dignity and pride until they are completely extinguished. While in Lilliput and Brobdingnag, Gulliver, although seen as an aberration of nature by the locals, always maintained and defended his own and England's dignity. Yet, upon witnessing the shattering of the myth of eternal life on the floating island, Gulliver, seen as irrational in this context, abandons the defense of humanity and instead acknowledges himself and the human race as absurd and ridiculous creatures. In Swift's era, most writers tended to view themselves as supporters of certain ideologies, beliefs, or political parties. In the 4th chapter, Swift arranged an experience for Gulliver that aimed to satirize this kind of blind dedication to ideals, often resulting in brainwashing. Unlike typical travelogue novels, Gulliver is not a progressive protagonist. He merely repeats his past mistakes, confirming Swift's view of human weaknesses. Swift believed that human nature was inherently flawed, and humans, unfortunately, refused to learn from their past experiences, preventing them from growing through failures. For a long time, Gulliver's actions of struggling to return to human society were seen as evidence of Jonathan Swift's anti-human tendencies and mental aberrations, especially considering that Swift was indeed diagnosed as mentally unstable in the last 3 years of his life. However, Gulliver is merely Swift's mouthpiece, and his thoughts and actions should not be equated with Swift himself. Swift's opposition was directed at moralists who attempted to deny the ugliness of humanity. He believed that humans should not blindly embrace absolute rationality and the supremacy of science. These acquired abilities did not guarantee moral perfection. Human beings are complex, just like this novel, which blends various discourses. Even today, scholars continue to interpret these 2 chapters from various perspectives, confirming that Gulliver's Travels is indeed a unique and complex text in the history of English literature. Gulliver's Travels is a political satire allegory masquerading as a travelogue. However, upon closer examination, this book contains shadows of literary genres that had not yet emerged at the time, such as fantasy literature, dystopian fiction, and dark humor. Its essence lies in questioning and distorting the notions of the everyday and the real. It is also the first novel to primarily focus on the theme of individual alienation in modern society. The repetitive, nonlinear narrative development corresponds to the real-world divisions within traditional class systems and parliamentary order, as well as the collapse of a rigorous, orderly political system and unquestionable centers of authority. Swift's distinctive writing style is showcased to the fullest in this work. He advocated for precise language and a straightforward, concise writing style that allows readers of all ages to naturally engage in the story. At the same time, he excelled in using sophisticated satirical techniques, particularly incisive irony and parody, injecting his sharp criticism and reflections into the story. His imagination was not solely based on traditional mythological themes and ghost stories, but was closely intertwined with real-world events, using a fantastical world to express his contemplation of the human condition. It should be emphasized that Gulliver is not Swift's alter ego, and he should not be regarded solely as a fictional narrator. He is a narrative tool that Swift uses to manipulate reader reactions. Satire is the true essence of this novel. Swift's writing inherits and further develops the satirical tradition that began with Chaucer, influencing many British writers from different periods, such as Fielding, Shaw, Orwell, Evelyn Waugh, and more. Gulliver's Travels not only plays a pivotal role in the history of English literature but also transcends the realm of literature as a great work that delves deep into questions about human nature and the ideal society. As long as humanity continues to strive to understand its essence, the doubts and reflections raised by Swift in this book will never become outdated. Alright, we've covered the key points in this session. First, Gulliver's Travels is not a children's book but a sharp and satirical work of literature. Author Jonathan Swift employed the popular travelogue genre in British literature at the time to deliver pointed satire on the political realities and social conditions in England. His writing was so direct in its allusions that it faced criticism and controversy. Second, the first 2 chapters of the novel have a structured and contrasting format, featuring vivid adventure stories and rich imagination that have long appealed to children. The later 2 chapters delve into more complex and profound themes, showcasing Gulliver's disillusionment with various human ideals, even inviting accusations of anti-humanism and mental aberration against Swift himself. Third, the book contains elements of literary genres that had not yet emerged at the time, such as fantasy literature, dystopian fiction, and black humor. Its essence lies in challenging and transforming notions of the everyday and the real. It is also the first novel primarily focusing on the theme of individual alienation in modern society. Fourth, Swift's distinctive writing style is showcased in Gulliver's Travels. He advocated for precise language and a straightforward, concise writing style that allows readers of all ages to naturally engage in the story. At the same time, he excelled in using sophisticated satirical techniques, particularly incisive irony and parody, injecting his sharp criticism and reflections into the story. His imagination was not solely based on traditional mythological themes and ghost stories but was closely intertwined with real-world events, using a fantastical world to express his contemplation of the human condition. Well, that concludes the content for this episode. If you enjoyed my video, please click like, subscribe to my channel, and share it with your friends. Thank you.